Hi, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We will, as we often do, get started just about 1 or 2 minutes late to give people a chance to log on. So if you'll be patient with us, we'll get started very shortly. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on Lobbying 101. First, a few housekeeping notes. All the slides of the presentation and the recording of the presentation will be available on our website tomorrow. You will also get an email with the recording and the slides. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to type them into the questions box, which should appear in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Please use that box rather than the chat option. We will take a break to answer questions a few times throughout the webinar. I'm Brooke Schipporeit, and I will be presenting on today's webinar, along with Joey Lindstrom and Tori Bourret. Let's begin. Just a reminder, for those of you who are interested in NLIHC's talking points for the upcoming Lobby Day on March 29th, we will not cover policy priorities on today's webinar. We will have an additional webinar on March 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to cover what we will be discussing with legislators on Lobby Day. We will send you the link to sign up for that session in the follow-up email from this webinar, though many of you may have already registered for it. Today we will start out discussing the basics of the federal legislative process and the convoluted budget process. We will then talk about why we advocate, tips for your lobby meetings, and then we will walk through an example of a legislative meeting. Tori and I will do a role play to provide an example of a lobby meeting and how to answer difficult questions. Then we will answer any final questions from the audience. I will now begin with a brief overview of the legislative process. There are 3 branches of the federal government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. Today we will be focusing on 2, the legislative branch, which is better known as Congress, and the executive branch, which is often referred to as the White House, the administration, or the president. Congress is made up of 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives has 435 voting members, plus some delegates who represent U.S. territories and the District of Columbia, but do not have voting rights in Congress. Representatives are elected for 2-year terms. The number of representatives per state depends on the state's population. California has the largest state population and 53 members, while Delaware and a few other states only have 1 representative. Each representative covers a geographic district which varies in size depending on how many people live in an area. The second chamber of Congress is the Senate, which is a smaller body. It's comprised of 100 voting members elected for 6-year terms. Each state has 2 senators, which means that almost every American has 2 senators and 1 representative. Again, There are not senators for DC or Americans who live in U.S. territories. If you are participating in Lobby Day, most of you should be doing 3 lobby meetings, or in other words, one with each of your members of Congress. The 2 bodies of Congress are responsible for creating laws. We are now going to walk through how a bill becomes a law. This is really important to understand so you know where in the legislative process you can have the most impact. In order for a bill to become a law, the first step is for the bill to be introduced, which can only be done by a member of Congress. The idea for the bill can come from the member themselves, the president, individual citizens, organizations, or companies. The president may put forth a plan, but it's always a member of Congress that submits the actual bill. A member of Congress will take the bill idea and introduce it into the House or Senate. At that point, it receives a bill number and is posted on congress.gov. If you want to follow a bill's progress, you can track them at congress.gov. Once the bill has been introduced, the next thing that happens is it goes to committee. Both the House and Senate have committees on a range of topics. The committees that NLIHC pays attention to are committees on appropriations, budget, veterans affairs, and transportation and infrastructure. There are a few committees that have different names in the Senate and in the House, but do similar things. The Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee both have jurisdiction over issues pertaining to the economy, the banking system, housing, insurance, and securities and exchanges. The House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee are both tax writing committees. Committees are led by the committee chair and the ranking member. The committee chair is a member of the majority party, and the ranking member is the committee leader of the minority party. Currently, the chair of each committee in the House is a Democrat, and each in the Senate is a Republican. And in both bodies, the ranking member is the opposite party of the chair. In committee, the bill is edited, also known as marking up, and then the committee decides if it will go to the floor of the House or the Senate to be voted on, or if it will stay in committee. Most bills remain in committee and never go to the floor. This is how some bills are killed. Another way bills are killed is when they are passed by committee but not the House or Senate leadership, but the House or Senate leadership never schedules them for a vote. If a bill does leave committee with approval of a majority of the committee members, then it goes to the floor. The floor means the entire House of Representatives or the entire Senate. When a bill goes to the floor, members of Congress are able to speak for or against the proposed bill. As a note, in the House, the Speaker of the House can determine how long a bill can be debated, when the debate is over, and whether to move forward with a vote. In the Senate, members can take over a debate on the Senate floor in order to prevent a vote on the bill. This is known as filibustering. The Senate can end a debate with a vote passed by 60 members. When the bill is ready to be voted on, a simple majority is needed in order to pass through each chamber. Once the bill passes in each chamber, a conference committee made up of House and Senate members meets if there are any differences between the 2 versions of the bill to reconcile these differences. The conference bill then goes back to both chambers where it gets voted on again. If it passes, it goes to the president. The president has one of 2 options. He can sign the bill or he can veto it. There are multiple ways a bill can be vetoed, which we won't get into on this webinar. If the president does decide to veto a bill, Congress needs a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate to override a president's veto.
All right. Thanks, Brooke, for going over some of the basics of how common legislation moves through the committee process and becomes law. What I'd like to do now is go over for just a bit the budget process, which many of you know has become a little bit of a mess in recent years. My name is Joey Lindstrom. I'm with the Fields team, and let's talk budget. All right. So each year, the president provides a budget request to Congress at the beginning of the year. This budget outlines the administration's priorities for federal programs. Federal law requires that the president's budget request is released on February 1st. Sorry, brief audio problem here. Okay, I think we're good. Strange. So getting back to where I was, federal law requires that the president's budget request is released on February 1st. That is rarely actually achieved. Based on the president's proposal, the House and Senate budget committees propose budget resolutions that set targets for spending and for tax revenue. These resolutions are sent to the House and Senate floors for a vote, where they can be amended. A House-Senate conference then resolves any differences. The budget resolution for the year is adopted when both chambers pass the final conference budget bill or report. Now, the budget resolution is not where the final amounts of money being spent are decided. It's just Congress deciding how much money overall they're going to spend on what types of activities. And for this reason, a congressional budget resolution does not need presidential approval. The House and the Senate budget committees decide to pick a different number very often than the budget in their budget resolution than what the president recommends in his own budget. Certainly, we're very hopeful that this will happen again for fiscal year 2020. The budget process involves not just picking a high-level number, but then also divvying up the pie to particular programs. So following adoption of the budget resolution, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees divide the discretionary spending set forth in the budget resolution among each of their 12 subcommittees. Some examples of the subcommittees include the Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, and the Subcommittee on Agriculture, Rural Development, and Food and Drug Administration. These are a couple of the key subcommittees that we pay attention to in the appropriations process. Each subcommittee conducts hearings on the programs under its jurisdiction and votes out a bill with funding levels for each program. The full Appropriations Committee in the House and Senate marks up the bill and sends it to the floor. Both chambers pass their bills and iron out the differences in conference. A final vote is taken on the bill that comes out of conference, and then the bill goes to the president to sign or veto. And if you followed the budget process in the last couple of months, you'll know it's this last stage of the process where things really hit a snag, finding something that Congress will pass and the president will sign. So, mechanisms do exist to enforce the terms of the budget resolution during the consideration of appropriations legislation. And a special mechanism known as reconciliation exists to expedite or speed up the consideration of mandatory spending and tax legislation. This happens when the budget process is taking too long and they need to work on some quick fixes. In this webinar, we're not going to dive into the details of reconciliation because it's indeed quite complicated, but we can answer any questions that you have when we get to the end of this section. So let's talk about the budget process. In recent years, Congress has had a hard time agreeing on the budget. Congress must pass the budget, and the president must sign appropriations bills by October 1st, which is the beginning of the new fiscal year, in order to fund all the national government's departments, agencies, and programs for the following year. If Congress and the president fail to pass all of the appropriations bills, there will be some agencies or programs that do not have the money appropriated to them that they need and are authorized to spend. In other words, there will be no money to spend on some legally established programs and national government priorities or functions. When this happens, Congress kicks the can down the road by passing a CR, which is a term you've probably heard a lot. This is a continuing resolution. It temporarily funds the programs and agencies for which appropriations bills have not been passed by the October 1st deadline. Basically, a CR is a temporary budget that allows more time for debate. Another term you will hear quite often is sequestration. Sequestration means across-the-board spending cuts. This is triggered when spending levels established by the continuing resolution are poised to exceed the budget caps, which were created by the Budget Control Act of 2011. Lawmakers must either pass a full budget that does not exceed the caps or raise the spending caps to avoid the automatic sequestration across-the-board cuts. This is a problem Congress faced when trying to pass the FY18 budget. They decided to raise the caps for a 2-year period. This year, we're certainly hoping that they do so again because the spending caps that they approved in FY18 are going to be expiring. The budget is important as a focus of our advocacy efforts. Though we've seen major gains in the last 2 years for key HUD programs, funding levels are still well below fiscal year 2010. The hardest hit programs include programs like public housing and the big block grant programs, community development block grant, or the home program, home investment partnerships. And as this chart clearly shows, we're still quite a ways away from where we were for HUD funding in FY 2010. We should also note that the 2 years of progress that we've seen over the last two budgets has really been the result of excellent and ongoing advocacy on the part of people throughout the country, including many of yourselves. So that's a little bit about the legislative process, a little bit about the budget process. I'd like to pause now to see if we have any early questions that we can answer. And if not, we'll just move on to some of the more meaty details of how to do a good lobby meeting. Brooke, do we have any questions at this point?
There aren't any.
Okay, so it looks like we don't have any questions in the questions box right now. Please feel free to put your questions in there throughout the webinar as things come to mind. The questions box should be on the right-hand side of your screen in your control panel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tori Bourret to talk a little bit about lobbying.
Great, thanks, Joey. Hi, everybody. I'm now going to turn to some considerations about lobbying. Sometimes people assume because they work for a 501c3, they can't lobby, but in fact, 501c3s can lobby if it fits their mission. The limits to lobbying are usually established by the amount of lobbying that is done. If an organization exceeds 5% of staff time or overall resources on lobbying, then the organization needs to register as a lobbyist or submit paperwork so they can be incorporated under the 501H designation rather than the 501c3 designation. The 5% standard is often called the insubstantial part test. There are some great resources around lobbying as a nonprofit provided by the Boulder Advocacy campaign of the Alliance for Justice. You can go to boulderadvocacy.org for more information, or you can talk to any of the NLIHC housing advocacy organizers. Now I'm going to talk about your role as an advocate and how you can use your knowledge of the legislative process to influence decision makers. So your senators and representatives make their decisions about how they're going to vote based on personal and political values. First, they consider their political party. They may vote based on party lines. So if they're a Democrat and the Democratic Party has decided they support a bill, they could support it based on that. They also consider what their constituents value when voting on a bill. Their constituents are their voters, so they want to represent what their voters want to ensure they are doing their job and get reelected. They may also consider their personal values, for example, their religious beliefs on caring for the poor. They also consider political and financial feasibility of the vote. You may often hear that your representative would love to support more homeless programs, but there just isn't enough money for it. Long-term members of Congress may avoid introducing bills or voting on bills that have any new spending. It's important to consider what it is you're asking your legislator to vote on. If you're asking for a very expensive request, it may be something that has to be worked out over a longer period of time, involving a larger advocacy campaign. Considering all of these things, it's important to realize that what you as a constituent value is a key part of how legislators make their decisions. They need your opinions and expertise to make decisions on legislation, and if they don't make the right decisions, you can hold them accountable by voting them out of office. So does advocacy work? This is a question we get a lot at NLIHC. In short, the answer is a resounding yes. We've talked to staffers and legislators and hear again and again that advocacy is important. The Congressional Management Foundation found that 94% of legislative staffers said that when a member of Congress hasn't come to a firm decision on an issue, in-person visits from constituents have a positive impact on their vote. The same study found that knowing how a bill will impact a district or state and knowing why a constituent supports or opposes a bill is crucial in making a decision about a bill. Unfortunately, members of Congress rarely get this information from their constituents. NLIHC has direct proof of advocacy working. There are so many examples. Just last year, there was significant momentum from both HUD and the White House to back legislation pushing for benefit cuts to housing programs, specifically in the form of rent increases and program time limits. NLIHC's members talk to legislators and their staff about the real impact these programs have on the livelihoods of low-income households. In the end, none of the proposed reforms were in the final budget bills voted on by the House and Senate. So something we often get questions about is, well, I come from a very conservative state. I know my senator is never going to become a champion on affordable housing, Or I come from a very liberal state and they already support these issues. Is it still worth me taking the time to talk to them? Yes. What is important to consider is that it's your role not to take someone from the far left of the screen, staunch opponent, to the far right, staunch supporter, but rather to move the staunch opponent to the opponent position or the neutral position. That in itself is very powerful. It makes it that much easier to get legislation passed if there aren't major objections raised about it. On the other hand, if a legislator who was a staunch supporter isn't hearing from housing advocates, they could move to the supporter position or the neutral position on an issue, which could decrease the chance of legislation getting passed. It's important to thank and praise members who do support affordable housing, to keep them in their staunch supporter category, and to ensure that our issues have champions in the legislature. Our supporters in Congress always appreciate when their leadership is acknowledged and praised.
Thanks, Tori. Now that we've covered the basics of how legislation moves through Congress and what your role is as an advocate, we're going to get into the meat of what a lobby visit looks like and how to ensure it goes successfully. First, a few key things to consider about lobbying. First, remember that a lobby visit is just a conversation. It happens in halls of power with people that have influence, but in the end, it's just a simple conversation. Very often, the staff people or the member of Congress you will be meeting with have less information about the issue than you do, so very often you will be the expert in the meeting. An additional consideration I would really like you to keep in mind is that no lobby meeting is the final conversation you will be having with any given individual. The best advocacy is advocacy that leads to building a relationship with a staff person or a member of Congress. So a lobby meeting is just one conversation in a series of conversations. So let's talk about what to do before your lobby meeting. For those of you attending this year's lobby day, the logistics of scheduling a meeting will vary. Some states will have captains who will set up meetings for their teams. Other smaller contingents will set up their own meetings. If you don't know the plan for lobby day, talk to your NLIHC organizer. When scheduling a lobby visit, you should call the office you would like to meet with and ask for the scheduler. Some offices will ask you to fill out a form, but most of the time a phone call will suffice. If you need help getting the number or the name of the scheduler, be sure to ask one of the NLIHC organizers. Please note the meeting will take place with higher level staff if the request comes from an actual constituent and not someone from NLIHC, though we are happy to help if needed. Before setting up your meetings, make sure you know where the offices are located, especially if you are scheduling multiple meetings in one day. The offices on Capitol Hill are spread out amongst a few buildings, and it takes time to walk between the buildings and go through security. Plan on 15 minutes to go from one office to another and 45 minutes to move from the Senate buildings to the House buildings, partly because you will have to go through security again. Planning accordingly is important so you don't arrive late to your meetings. When trying to schedule a meeting, calling about 2 weeks ahead is the best way to go. So if you're attending our Lobby Day event on March 29th, right now is actually the time to begin scheduling these meetings. Calling further out than that can often lead to a request to call again. Many offices indicate they don't know what votes will be happening that far out or which staffers will be available to meet. But of course, if you wait too long, the staff members may not have time to meet with you. I mentioned meeting with staff members because in most instances, that is who you will be meeting with. Oftentimes, meeting with staff members is just as good as or even better than meeting with the representative. The member of Congress relies on their staff for key information as they make decisions. It's also true that when you meet with staff, they are more likely to have larger amounts of time to explore the various issues you are discussing and to ask good follow-up questions that provide for more dialogue. Oftentimes, when you meet with a member of Congress, the meeting will be rather brief because of their very busy schedules. If you can, do research on the member of Congress and the staff person you are meeting with before you're meeting with them. For example, if you can say, "It's great to be meeting with you today. I was happy to see the Congresswoman received an award on a particular issue." These are the types of things that can show you are interested in what they are doing and not just looking for them to be interested in your issues. It establishes a tone of partnership that can be very helpful. Those are some key considerations before your lobby meeting. Now I'm going to turn it to Joey to share some key considerations for during your lobby meeting.
Great, thank you, Brooke. Key things to keep in mind during a lobby meeting. Number one, always introduce yourself and your organization and declare yourself to be a constituent of that particular member of Congress. If you are not a constituent, explain how your organization works with this member of Congress and their constituents and provides services in that district. So if you don't live in a particular member's district, but your organization works in that district, make sure they understand that you have some amount of clout as a constituent. You should use the meeting to educate your elected official and the staff members about the work that you do and the issues that you care about most specifically. Remember, if your organization does not allow you to lobby as their representative, you can still refer to the work that you do as informing your individual perspective on any given issue as you proceed with the meeting, just speaking for yourself. You should, as often as possible, provide data and experience about the issues you are talking about. Very often, this takes the shape of numbers and stories. At NLIHC, we work really hard to take the national data that we calculate and break it down at the congressional district, city, or county level, so that some facts about the affordable housing crisis are expressed in a way that has local context. We'll share an example on the next slide. Another thing to remember is to connect your work to the elected official as much as possible. This is another reason to do your research on them before your meeting. If you can connect your work on affordable housing to the elected official's interest in, for example, better outcomes for children, this can create a key connection and lead to a stronger relationship moving forward. You might find sometimes you're talking to a member of Congress who doesn't believe deeply in poverty reduction or homelessness, but is committed, for example, to veterans issues or senior citizens. Connecting your issue to things they already care about will always be really beneficial. Finally, always make a specific ask in your lobby meeting. Always make sure that when you talk about an issue, you connect it to a specific piece of legislation or perhaps a Dear Colleague letter circulating in Congress that a representative can take action on, something that they can either support or oppose. Make it a question where they can give you a yes or no answer. Now, very often they won't give you a yes or no answer. They'll simply give you, well, this is helpful information and we'll take it under consideration. We'll think about what you're asking. That's an acceptable answer. You shouldn't expect that your members of Congress will know how they stand on every issue when it's brought up, or that staff members should have an answer right away. In fact, you can use this as an opportunity to follow up later to provide more information or to see if they have any further questions. When you're finishing your meeting, always try to leave behind materials. If you leave behind materials, that makes it harder for them to forget all about you once you walk out the door. When you do leave behind materials, you should not assume that they will necessarily be read, but you can reference them when you make your follow-ups. For those of you participating in NLIHC's event on March 29th, we will have leave behind packets for all of you to take to your meetings. So on the next slide, we'll look a little bit at some logistics for lobby meetings. There are definitely a couple of things you want to consider on the day of and in preparation. First is always make sure to arrive early. You'll want to arrive with enough time to clear security and to find the room in the building where your meeting is occurring. Some of the buildings, like the Rayburn House office building, are really confusing and really large. So just make sure you give yourself enough time. If you're doing your meeting in a group with a coalition of other organizations or other people presenting on different aspects of homelessness and housing or different aspects of poverty, you'll want to prepare an agenda ahead of time for who speaks when and who speaks on what issues and makes what asks. If you're attending the NLIHC Lobby Day on March 29th, you'll note that there will be a lot more in your Lobby Day packet than you probably have time to cover at a given meeting. You may choose to discuss 3 top issues out of the many that we provide for you. You may also wish to discuss a couple of policy issues that are not in NLIHC's policy materials or in the Lobby Day packet. You know, these are your meetings and you should treat them that way. You should make sure that you pick and choose which issues are most important for you to bring up. I say you should always make a specific ask in your lobby meetings, but in some cases, that might not always make sense. You may have meetings with staff or legislators who don't understand the issue very well and are considering affordable housing for the first time. In these instances, your meeting will cover a lot of background information, and you'll be providing a lot of detail about what affordable housing is and why it matters. You might not get into the finer points of policy until you do a follow-up conversation via phone or another meeting. But it's important to remember that these meetings can be foundational for future conversations as you build a relationship with that congressional office. I'd like to show you an example of a congressional district profile. It's on your screen right now. Congressional district profiles are one of many fact sheets that NLIHC uses to illustrate the housing shortage in America. And you'll see at the top we have district level renter statistics. And these statistics include things like the shortage of affordable and available homes at certain income levels, as well as the percentages of cost burdens that people face. Below the congressional district statistics, what we have are some state level statistics that will show for your particular state what the crisis looks like. And then we also have some regional metro area or county level statistics that might be helpful in your meetings to include. If you're participating in Lobby Day with us on March 29th, we will have the appropriate congressional district housing profiles and state profiles in your leave behind packets. We will make these for each lobby meeting, and you can always pick up additional copies at the Legislative Action Center at the Policy Forum event. So you've done your lobby meeting. It was very successful. What do you do afterwards? What's your follow-up strategy? After your lobby meeting, you should always send a thank you email or a thank you card to the people you met with. But additionally, you might want to express gratitude through a tweet or a blog post. Make sure that you take a picture during your meeting so that you can include it in any potential tweets or blog posts, right? So additionally, when you sort of express your gratitude publicly, you can say, we were happy to meet with our legislator and discuss these issues, and we look forward to working with them in the future. By doing this, it makes your relationship a little bit stronger because you'll have given public acknowledgement of their efforts and availability, and you'll also make them sort of aware of their accountability because you will publicly talk about what was discussed in that meeting, and they will now have to follow up on the commitments that they made to you or get more information on questions that they said they needed answered. So please share what you learned during a lobby meeting with your network. Share with your members, with your board, with your volunteers, and especially share with us here at NLIHC. We can take the information that you provide that you learned in your meeting and follow up with specific action items. We can clarify any questions that members of Congress or staff might have, and we can get them to engage on specific legislation in some cases. We're in a better position when we know the outcomes and details of your lobby meetings. Always follow up and build a relationship with the office. Make sure that you're continuing the conversation. Remember, every lobby meeting is just one conversation in a series of conversations. Lobbying should never be considered something that you do in one meeting, but rather a full process. All right, so in a moment, we're going to do a role play on what a standard lobby visit or a usual lobby visit might look like. But before we get to that role play, I'd like to throw it open and see if anybody has any questions. Brooke, anything in the questions box?
Yeah, there are few here, but
okay, I'm taking a quick look at the questions box. If everybody will allow me a brief pause here. Thank you. Okay, so we do have some questions. What I'm going to do is we're going to take these when we get done with our role play in just a moment, and we'll take a look at more of those. So for right now, if you have questions, feel free to put them into the questions box on the right-hand side in your control panel, and we'll move forward with it in just a bit. For right now, we're going to switch our technology platform. You will no longer be seeing the slides. You'll be actually seeing a webcam so that Tori and Brooke can present this to you, live news edition style. And if you'll just give us a second on that technology, it looks like we should be good. Yes?
Should be.
Okay, so it looks like you should be seeing Tori and Brooke in front of you right now, and we will move forward with our role play. Take it away, ladies.
Hey, guys. Hi. Hi, I'm Tori Bourret.
Hi, I'm Brooke Schipporeit.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
I'm with the Awesome Homeless Agency in Pennsylvania, and actually my constituent is Representative Smith. I'm a constituent of Representative Smith. So I'm here today to just talk a little bit about some of the issues I care about, specifically around affordable housing and getting more funding for that.
That's great. Thank you so much for coming in. So as I mentioned, I'm Brooke Schipporeit. I'm the legislative assistant for Congresswoman Smith. Sorry she can't meet with you today. She is very busy, as you can imagine. But I will be sure to share, what we talk about today with her.
That's great. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And it's great to meet you. So this is a packet that I have. It's a lot of the materials are provided by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition.
Oh, great.
If you open it up, you'll see a lot of great fact sheets that I'll be referring to today during our meeting.
Thank you. These materials are always very helpful. Thanks for bringing this.
Great. And so just to give a little background about myself, I've been with the Awesome Homeless Agency in Pennsylvania for 20 years, but it's only been in the past 3 that I've been working with the Resident Advisory Board with residents who are really advocating for issues in their housing. And we're also, my organization is also a member of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, whose mission is really to ensure that the lowest income folks, specifically renters, have access to safe, decent, affordable, and accessible housing.
Okay, great.
And so what brings me to this meeting really is my concern about the lack of affordable homes for the lowest, like I mentioned, lowest income population, specifically those making below $12,000 a year. And those are most of the folks, or all of the folks that we serve at the homeless agency that I work at. So we just realized there's not enough funding coming from the federal government to provide enough permanent supportive housing for in order to house all the folks that are homeless in Pennsylvania, and that's a really big need that we're identifying right now.
Okay, so that really is unfortunate. As I'm sure you know, we're in a very difficult budget environment right now, where we're going to have to make a lot of tough choices. So that's something we'll take into consideration, though.
Yeah, that's true. I get that. And the budget environment is always pretty tough. In this packet, actually, let me show you, there's a budget chart that shows all the levels of funding for various HUD programs over the previous several years. So as you can see, the support for subsidized housing programs hasn't been keeping pace with the needs in our communities. Yeah, sorry, that was, yes.
So where does this information come from, these numbers in here?
So these numbers come from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition using HUD data. And I want to draw your attention actually to the numbers on cost burden and severe cost burden. So a household is cost burden if they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent, and they're severely cost burdened if they're paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And so as you can see, the problem is most severe among folks that have the lowest income levels.
Yeah, this data is very useful, actually. Can I follow up if we have any questions after going through this a little bit more?
Yes, please do. That would be great. I also wanted to draw your attention to this Congressional district profile. You'll see that NLIHC has broken down this number of available affordable homes for the Congresswoman's district, showing a shortage of 7,438 homes for extremely low-income households. And this means housing that is not only affordable, but also not occupied by people in a higher income category.
Okay, wow.
And before I wrap up today, I just want to make a final point with you. So many people wrongly believe that extremely low-income folks are already served by federal housing policy because of the prevalence of vouchers and public housing units. But the truth really is the opposite. Only 1 in 5 households that need housing assistance actually receive it. And that's really why we're here today, to advocate for more funding for HUD. We want to continue to see the budget for HUD increase by 10% or more over the next few years, as opposed to being cut year after year.
Okay.
And can I ask, do you know if the Congresswoman is going to oppose any of the deep budget cuts and program eliminations that President Trump has proposed in his budget?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know she values the programs that HUD operates and will certainly take a strong stance to defend those funding levels, but as I mentioned with the tough budget environment right now, I just don't expect us to get very far beyond the flat funding for programs this year, but we will certainly push against the steep budget cuts that are proposed.
I appreciate that. That means a lot. We appreciate her support, and I'll be sure to follow up with any additional information that may be helpful to the Congress.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming in today. It was great to meet you. And I'll be sure to share this with the Congresswoman.
Thanks. Great to meet you too.
Thanks. So that was an example of a pretty standard meeting, but there's a variety of things that can happen. So I urge you to be flexible. Sometimes you can have a meeting with a staff person or a member of Congress who doesn't agree with supporting affordable housing programs and has some challenging questions. Sometimes there will be some difficulty in scheduling and you'll have to have your meeting in the lobby or the office, so just try to be as flexible as you can. So now we're going to share a few examples of some difficult questions so you can get a sense of how to react in a meeting when you are provided with some opposition. If while going through these questions you come up with your own that you would like feedback on how to respond, feel free to type them into the question box and we will try to get to them today. So one question we often hear is, how are we going to fund more housing?
So one example of a solution we have is protecting and expanding the National Housing Trust Fund. The National Housing Trust Fund is the only funding source exclusively focused on providing states with flexible resources targeted to serve households with the clearest, most acute housing needs. My organization supports efforts to expand the Housing Trust Fund through any infrastructure bill, housing, finance reform, and other legislative avenues. So by law, 90% of the Housing Trust Fund dollars must be used for the production, preservation, rehabilitation, or operation of affordable rental housing, and 10% may be used to support homeownership activities for first-time home buyers who are very low income. The Housing Trust Fund is currently supported by a 4.2 basis point assessment on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This can be expanded via housing finance reform or infrastructure packages.
Great. So depending on how you choose to use NLIHC's data and resources, you may hear the counterpoint that we present a lot of national data, but how does that national data relate to the state that you're talking about?
So one answer you could use when you're in your meetings is to say, yes, it's true that the data is national, but my experience of these programs exists locally, and then share an example from your life or work of how the data represents the local experience. You could also say, to the extent that I'm able to put together some local data, I'll provide that to you in a follow-up email, and I'll also check with staff at NLIHC to see what additional data they may have for your district.
So that's an example of how you would answer that question if you don't have local data. But remember, if you're attending Lobby Day, your lobby packet we provide will have a housing profile that breaks things down for each locality, similar to the one we showed you before. Also, don't be afraid to just say that you don't know the answer to a question. It's okay to say, I don't know, but I'll follow up with additional information later. That's perfectly fine.
So let's move on to another difficult question.
You're presenting a lot of information about the affordable housing crisis that we all acknowledge is an issue. But what can Congress do about it? What solutions can Congress offer?
So Congress has offered significant solutions for many years through programs that are proven to be effective. They just need to be funded to an appropriate scale to make an impact that meets the needs brought on by the housing shortage. We hear on our end from local leaders that they need greater resources from the federal government to be able to address homelessness and affordable housing.
What about the state and local governments, though? Aren't they better equipped to handle their own unique challenges with housing and homelessness issues?
So they can be better equipped, yes, in terms of the actual administration of these programs. And I think that's why programs such as CDBG have a consolidated plan that's done at the local level, or the low-income housing tax credit has a qualified allocation plan that's done at the state level. or even housing choice vouchers are distributed by public housing authorities. But the problem with looking at local or state solutions is that they don't have the resources to make an impact on the grand scale that the federal government can, and that's why we're looking to the federal government for solutions to the affordable housing crisis.
So that's a way you could answer a question like that. We have a couple more challenging questions to give you examples of how to answer them. One is, aren't you concerned that these programs will just lock people into a condition of poverty and make people dependent on continuing to receive these programs?
So that's not a concern I have based on experiences I've had in working with many low-income people who we serve. I'm also familiar with data for public housing and for SNAP or the food stamp benefits, which shows most people who use these types of programs actually only use them temporarily. And in many cases, these programs are successful in lifting folks out of poverty. I don't have those facts with me today, but I can follow up with some links to various reports that show these numbers and show the evidence of what I've been saying.
So that's a great way to answer that challenging question. Feel free to draw from our Place to Call Home report, which we co-released with our partners in the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, or CHCDF, which shares a lot of personal narratives on how federally funded housing programs are effective and positively impacting people all over the country. Feel free to use those stories or similar stories of your own. So one more challenging question you might get is, what do you think of work requirements, drug testing, and minimum rents to address the underfunding problem?
So it's pretty common that people think there needs to be accountability for low-income people who receive housing assistance. But the fact of the matter is many people who receive housing subsidies are not eligible to work because they're elderly or they have disabilities or they're children. And the folks that are able to work are already doing so. They may just be, they're working at, they're not able to find enough work, so they're working part-time jobs, or they may not have access to transportation to get them to work all the time for a 40-hour job. And so, or facing other barriers such as childcare too. So work isn't necessarily the cure-all that everybody believes it is. But what we do know is that people who receive housing assistance try to work every bit as much as people who don't receive any assistance. So if you look at your state housing profile at NLIHC.org, you'll see that we've broken down extremely low-income households to reflect who is participating in the workforce, who is a senior, who cannot work due to a disability or a caretaker responsibility. At most, 10% of extremely low-income households can be thought of as choosing not to work, but even in those circumstances, it's more likely that we just don't have data to put them in one of our other categories. Great.
All right. So that was our role play. I invite all of you to begin submitting questions. I'm going to go back to sharing just our slides now. All right, show screen, and we're going to go screen 2.
To end the webcam.
And then I shut off the webcam. All right, I think I'm back. I think we've got just the slides once again. Questions right now from any attendees. I know I saw a couple in the questions box. Let me pop that out here and we'll see what we got. 1 second. All right, well, I have a question from Dave Bazell in Maryland. And Dave asks if there are considerations about doing lobbying during NLIHC's lobby day versus setting up individual lobbying meetings another time. You know, the truth is, Dave, and for those of you who live close to DC, yeah, you can set up lobby visits whenever you like with staff members or members of Congress. They don't have to happen on NLIHC's lobby day at all. There are a few benefits to doing it on our lobby day. One is that if you would like to, for example, meet with Senator Van Hollen in coalition with several other people who also have expertise and clout, doing that on lobby day can be really convenient, a really good way to organize that. Additionally, we'll make sure that you have a lot of information packets available. And then thirdly, one of the purposes of doing a lobby day is for us to talk about the impact of our network and the number of meetings we were able to have with elected officials on one day. It gives us an opportunity to have staff members not just hearing about these issues, but sort of hearing about these issues all at one time, which can create a little bit of a discussion amongst them on Capitol Hill. So I'd say there are some reasons to do it, but if there are reasons that you're unavailable to do it and you want to do meetings on another day, that's fine too. Just make sure that however you're doing it, you're establishing that relationship with staff members and talking to your members of Congress as often as you can. Okay, so I'm getting another question now about how we should talk about housing programs in relation to the federal deficit. That's a good question. I think a lot of people are concerned about the debt and concerned about the deficit, and we'll get into some of the specific budget asks in our webinar next week. But one thing that I would just sort of say is the best thing we can do is make an argument for housing programs. It's not our job to decide what should be cut to pay for the housing programs. You know, some people might say it should be, missile defense programs or needless agricultural subsidies or the mortgage interest deduction, or, there are any number of things that might pay for housing programs. The best thing we can do is put ourselves in a situation where we feel like housing programs have been given a strong argument with members of Congress. Okay, so those are the questions that we have right now. Though, if any of you are still typing them into the box, we'll return for questions one more time. I want to draw everyone's attention to next week's webinar. On Thursday of next week, we're really going to go over what will be in the Lobby Day packet, what our high priority asks are, what the specific pieces of legislation are that we're focusing on, and what the budget situation is. So please join next week's webinar. That's where we're going to get into some of the details for right now, our policy priorities this spring. Finally, I want to remind all of you about another way to be involved with NLIHC, which is by being an NLIHC member. Most of you are coming to the policy forum, which means that most of you are members, but if you're not, please consider joining us, because our strength on Capitol Hill relies on the voices of the more than 1,000 organizational and individual members throughout the country. And then finally, stay in touch with our field team. Kyle, who's on the slide here, his contact information is up there, but he actually hasn't started. Won't start until Monday of next week. But that's our fields team, and we exist to help you be effective advocates in every moment that you can, and we really love hearing from you. So there's our Twitter handles, our email addresses, and our phone numbers. We really hope to be in touch with you again soon. And with that, I think I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining the webinar, and we hope to see you all soon. All right, bye.